minutes for everyone to settle in before I introduce him today. Maybe if we're waiting in the chat, it'd be helpful to get a sense where students are joining from. So if you want to send where you're based right now, maybe the city could be exciting to see. Right now I'm in San Francisco in California. I think Amitabh is joining from Boston. Great. Yeah, all over the place. Very exciting. Great. So our speaker this morning is Amitabh Chandra, who is the Ethel Zimmerman Weiner Professor of Public Policy and Director of Health Policy Research at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and the Henry and Allison McCants Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, where he directs the joint MS-MBA program in the life sciences. His research focuses on innovation and pricing in the biopharmaceutical industry, value in healthcare, medical malpractice, and racial disparities in healthcare. And we're so excited to have him join us this morning and really hear about missing medicines from him. Amitabh, over to you.
Thank you, Tiara, and welcome to everybody. It's so exciting for me to see all the cities and towns that you're from. I myself was born in Delhi in India. I came to the United States when I was 18. So special shout out to everybody in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. I also see friends of mine from Lagos, Nigeria. That was another great city that I had the privilege of visiting. And I see friends from Sao Paulo, Brazil. And then there's so many cities that I've never visited. So it's just so great to see you all and have you all here today. I'm an economist by training, so I tend to view the world through the lens of economics. There's many other lenses that you can view the world through, but I want to spend the next hour sharing with you why I think thinking about medicines and how we create the medicines that society really wants through an economic lens might actually give us very interesting public policies to think about that we have not been thinking a lot about. So as Tiara said, I think feel free to use the chat if you have questions. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question that you want to ask. If you have a question that is a general question, a clarifying question, I would encourage you to use the chat. And then we'll definitely have time for like a deeper dive where I can call on you if you raise your hand and things like that. One small tip I'll give you that I give all my students is that, one of the great lessons in life is not just learning facts. It's not just learning how to use the facts, but it's also learning how to be curious about things that one might not agree with. This ability to listen is an important one. So I'm not saying you should listen to me. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, if I'm talking about, say, oncology drugs, cancer drugs, I think it's fine to say, what about diabetes drugs and what about Alzheimer's drugs? But it's probably not going to be the best use of our time if someone said, you're talking about oncology drugs, but why are you not talking about poverty? Or why are you not talking about education? I'm never going to talk about poverty and education, right? So I think there's this aspect of listening where you want to kind of listen, but you want to listen and kind of travel with the speaker in the direction, the pastures the speaker is speaking to. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to talk to you about this idea of missing medicines. Missing medicines is this idea that I've had for many years that the world is capable of having many more medicines for diseases than we actually have right now. We spend a lot of time talking about the high price of medicines, which is true. Many medicines are unaffordable. I'm not going to talk about that problem right now. The medicines are here, they're unaffordable, that's a problem, right? I'm talking about a different problem. What about the diseases for which we just don't have medicines? No one has invented those medicines. In some sense, if the medicine came and it was unaffordable, in some sense, that's a better world to be in than a world without the medicine, right? So COVID-19 happens and it's, 1 year ago and there's no vaccine. That's a missing medicine. Because once the vaccine is built, then we just have to have a conversation about, what does government need to spend to make that vaccine available to everyone? They just have to write a check. Maybe we're not willing to write the check, but that's a much easier problem to have, the problem of writing a check, than just waiting for this vaccine, right? So COVID-19 happens and you could be Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but there's no vaccine for you. So you might have $150 billion in your bank account, right? So much money. What can you do with it? If you have COVID, you have COVID, right? So we want to think about these medicines for diseases like Alzheimer's, for ALS, for many types of cancer, where we have nothing at all for the patients who have these diseases. So some of the questions that I want to cover with you in the next hour are up here, right? So these are topics that you'll learn the answer to, or some of the answer to in the next hour, right? Like, how do firms, manufacturers think about doing R&D? Why do they not do R&D for malaria? We have so much malaria in the world. Why do companies not make drugs for malaria? What is the role of government policy in overcoming some of these decisions that companies make? How do we ensure that the right people, all of you, think about entering the life sciences and helping firms make different decisions? What do we do about the fact that so much of the world's innovation in healthcare, and particularly in new medicines, is only happening in 2 cities? The world has so many cities, but why does Boston and why do San Francisco, why are all the companies that do this innovation sitting in Boston and San Francisco? We want to understand the answer to that question, because if we understood the answer carefully and we learned what was the recipe in Boston and San Francisco, maybe we could do this innovation in other cities. Maybe we could do this innovation in Beirut. Maybe we could do this innovation in Lahore. Maybe we could do it in Hong Kong. Maybe we could do it in Moscow. Maybe we could do it in Nairobi, right? But we have to understand what is special about Boston and San Francisco that is not present in other great American cities like Houston, right? Houston's a great city. Why is it not happening in Houston? Why is it not happening in London? Why is it not happening in Paris? So those are the kinds of things we want to spend some time talking about. One question that we can start with by asking is, like, where do new drugs come from? And usually science people say it's all serendipity. Just through luck, you get drugs. Some scientist named Fleming, he goes off on vacation, he comes back, and he finds in a petri dish, penicillin or something like that is growing in a petri dish. That's this pure serendipity view of drug discovery. That is definitely true. Lots of drugs are discovered purely by chance. But that is not a good recipe for society. Society should not be relying on chance to discover medicines. The sick are very important people. We have to do a lot for the sick, and we can't be doing a lot for the sick if we're relying on chance. We have to think about the public policies that are in place to overcome this kind of chance, right? So we want to talk about at least 3 factors. What medicines are we missing and why? And I'm going to go through 3 reasons why medicines may be missing. One reason is that for a lot of diseases, our willingness to pay for medicines is very low. It's very, very low. And because it's low, firms don't make drugs for diseases where society's willingness to pay is low. That's unfortunate, because if society had a higher willingness to pay, we would get the medicines. There's another set of medicines where society's willingness to pay is actually quite high. Society is willing to pay a lot of money for these medicines, but the firm doesn't have sufficient incentives to make the medicine. So an example of this might be a situation where the firm only has 10 years of patent life. A patent is basically protection from someone else copying your idea. It's a protection granted to the company filing a patent. But if you have insufficient patent life, then you're not going to do innovation that might take longer than the patent life to do. So maybe the the R&D that you need to do to make the medicine takes 30 years, but you have 10 years of patent life. Well, you will never do that R&D because at the end of 10 years, the patent expires. And so even if you're successful 30 years later, someone else can copy your invention. So you're not going to do it. Society loses and you lose. There are some areas of medicine where the failure rates are so high. Every time you try to do the R&D, the failure hits you and you're not successful. So you don't end up making a lot of profit in expectation. Chances are you won't make a lot of profit. That's another area where we struggle. And we want to talk a lot about, in the second part of this talk, what are the public policies that could overcome these forces? So to set this up, I want us to compare two diseases, malaria and gout. So malaria is a big disease, as many of you know, right? If you are joining this meeting from Africa, from most of Asia, you know that you could have malaria, and not just malaria, it could be Zika, it could be any of the mosquito-borne diseases. About 200 million people got malaria last year alone. And in terms of deaths, anywhere between 600 to 700,000 deaths a year happen because of malaria. Now compare malaria to another disease, gout. To get gout, you kind of have to be rich, right? Because the way you get gout is by eating very, very rich foods. You're eating very kind of, you're eating a lot of salami, for example, drinking a lot of wine, and you'd get gout, which is like knee pain. So it's painful, but it's not going to kill you. It's fatty foods and alcohol that give you gout. And that's a picture of Henry VIII, and he was known for having gout. So think about these two diseases, malaria or gout. Malaria, and if you're a company, you're Merck, right? Or you're Pfizer, you're thinking about, do I start to make a new drug for malaria or a new drug for gout? Malaria, there's many more people with malaria than there are for gout. So normally you would think companies would start to do R&D in a disease like malaria, right? In my next slide, you can see the number of deaths by region for malaria. There are thousands of deaths that happen because of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. But if you look at what companies are doing, and you look at clinical trials around the world for gout versus malaria, what you see is, despite malaria being a really big disease, profit maximizing companies are not going to be interested in malaria, right? They're going to be much more interested in making drugs for gout. Malaria is a bigger disease, but you're not going to be able to charge a lot of money for a successful malaria pill. Why? Because most of the people who have malaria are very poor, and most of the deaths happen to children, little kids, 5 and 6 years old. You can't charge a little kid any money, right? You could charge government some money, but not a lot of money, right? Government is not going to pay that much money for the well-being of children, because children don't vote. So government's going to be much more interested in drugs that help, older people who actually vote. So it's unfortunate. But that then becomes a source of missing medicines. This low willingness to pay, this low ability to pay for malaria drugs reduces the amount of money that firms can make from malaria. And so we don't see malaria innovation. And so the innovation we see comes from this table over here. The worldwide market for medicines is about $1.2 trillion a year. Huge numbers, growing at about 4-5% every year. The US market is a little less than half of that. So you can see US is 485 billion a year out of that 1.2 trillion. And if you look at the top 5 countries in Europe, right? So you look at the UK, you look at Germany, you look at France, right? These would be the largest economies in Europe. They account for about $180 billion of drug spending. So the US market is more than double the size of the top 5 European market. I'm telling you all this because what it means is, at the end of the day, firms are looking at what the US is willing to pay. That's a problem because the US doesn't have malaria. So the US's willingness to pay for malaria is very small. And so we're not going to get great drugs from malaria, right? Which is a huge problem because it's not that hard to take on malaria. Things like gout and things like cancer, much easier to take on for companies than something like malaria. You can see in the next graph what drugs we're actually getting. So if you look in the early stage of clinical drug development and you ask, what are the diseases that companies are studying? You can see that light blue color light up. It's called oncology, which means cancer. About half of the R&D that we're doing in the world today is R&D in cancer. Why? Americans have cancer, right? Americans live to an age where they get cancer. Very high willingness to pay. So a lot of the pharma R&D goes into cancer. But if you look around the world, what do people have? They have infectious disease. They need vaccines for a variety of viral diseases. There's a lot of respiratory problems around the world, like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There's a lot of endocrine problems around the world. This would be like diabetes. Diabetes is purple, it's endocrinology. Look how little research is happening for respiratory ailments, endocrinology, vaccines, relative to neurology and oncology. Neurology is Alzheimer's, oncology is cancer, right? So this is a problem for the world because the medicines the world is getting at the end of the day are not really medicines for the problems that most members in society have. And this view that, oh, it's just serendipity that will change it is wrong, right? What will change it is a greater willingness to pay for the medicines that society really is willing to pay for, right? So we'll talk about that. So that's kind of one source of missing medicines. The other source of missing medicines is sometimes you don't need a medicine. Sometimes you just need prevention, right? So think about smoking. How did we really reduce lung cancer? Well, we made drugs for lung cancer for sure. But the number one thing we did with lung cancer was we figured out that smoking was bad for you, right? By the way, if you're a smoker, the one thing you can do for yourself is to stop smoking. Seriously, there's no drugs that can really help you at the end of the day if you are a smoker. I mean, we can buy you a few months of life, but you will probably get lung cancer and you will probably die of lung cancer, which is very sad because you could just stop smoking. Smoking is interesting, right? Because if you look at what happened with smoking, in the US stopped smoking around 1970, right? There were all these warnings in the US, cigarettes will kill you. The Surgeon General encouraged people to stop smoking. So you can see the blue line. People start to stop smoking. Per capita cigarette consumption falls dramatically starting around 1970. What do you see then? You see declines in lung cancer for men and women. The lung cancer death rate starts to fall, right? And this was not because of drugs. This was because of a reduction in cigarette smoking. No drug that humankind has produced has been as powerful as this very simple insight that we should stop smoking. And smoking it's not just smoking that can kill you. I think living in a very polluted environment is also like smoking. And so I think any government that kind of thinks intelligently about how to improve the public health, how to clean the air, would be doing a lot of health benefits for its population. But we underinvest in discoveries like this. The discovery being not a new molecule, not a new drug. The discovery being this insight that smoking can kill you because of lung cancer. And when we reduce lung cancer, it turns out we reduced a variety of other cancers as well. There was cancer of the mouth and throat. There was cancer of the esophagus. There was cancer of the stomach, the pancreas, the uterine system. We reduced some leukemia and some kidney cancer as well, right? Nothing in this willingness to pay for drugs, even if we increased it, even if we made it very, very large, suppose we could do that, nothing is going to save human life as much as prevention. The problem with prevention is you can't make money discovering new ways to prevent disease, right? If you were a company, you don't get a patent. You can't charge money for the insight that reducing smoking would save your life. How are you going to make a business out of that? And so it should not be surprising that the world probably doesn't have as many preventive insights as the preventive insights that actually occur, right? So for a lot of other diseases, maybe prevention would help. but we don't have enough research on it because private companies are certainly not going to do the research. That research is all going to be financed by the government. And the government doesn't really think about problems over 20, 30, 40 years. It ought to, but it doesn't, right? That's a big challenge for all of us. I think some of the other things that I want to discuss with you are this idea that I want to kind of shift a little bit to other ideas for why we have missing medicine. So I've talked a little bit about, one source of missing medicines is missing prevention. Another source of missing medicines is like low willingness to pay by governments, low willingness to pay by philanthropists, right? So that discourages innovation. But there's other reasons also. One of them is just the very long length it takes to do research and development to make a new medicine. On average, it takes about 12 years from the moment you start the research to the moment your drug is approved, about 12 years. So it's a very long time. It's not like it took Apple 12 years to make an iPhone, right? It took them a long time, but it didn't take them 12 years to make an iPhone. And there's, as you all know, this, just the slide on the right is something you all know. You do studies, in the Petri dish, in a lab on rats and mice. That's called preclinical research. Then you start to do a phase 1 trial in human beings where you just try to show your drug is safe. You don't show that your drug works. You just try to show that it's actually a safe drug. And then you start to show, the evidence of effectiveness in a phase 2 and phase 3. You have to do all these trials. They're very expensive and they take a lot of time, right? And you can see over here in my next slide, what I want you to see is that the failure rates, these trials fail all the time. The failure rates, you can see over here, you can see two things over here. One on the left is that the duration of the clinical trials has been increasing, right? So in red, you can see the typical phase 3 clinical trial is taking us about 3 years to do, little over 3 years to do, the phase 3. And the typical phase 2 is taking us a little over 3 years as well. So that's 6 years in clinical trials. And the likelihood of failing the trial varies a lot by the kind of disease you're studying. So look at vaccines. On average, the vaccines fail about 10% of the time, right? I'm sorry, on average, the vaccines succeed about 10% of the time. For rare diseases, you succeed about 30% of the time. For something like oncology, you succeed about 15% of the time, which means in oncology, 85% of the time you fail, right? Why is this important? This is important because companies are trying to make money. They're going to go into areas of research where they're likely to succeed, not areas of research where they're likely to fail, which is why over time, they're much more likely to be studying rare diseases like cystic fibrosis than they are to be studying a big disease like diabetes or cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in most countries. We don't study it enough. Why not? Because the success rates are very, very low. Most cardiovascular drugs fail, right? So that's a problem because we would like to get a lot more things like a lot better cardiovascular drugs than we are getting right now. This is important for another reason. The graph on the left is important for another reason, because the longer it takes me to do a clinical trial, regardless of success or failure, the less time I have available to make money from my drug. Why is that? That's because of this point we discussed earlier around patents. When you start drug discovery, you do your human trials, you get 20 years of patent life. That 20 is just a number that countries around the world have used since the 16th century. The Venetians protected you from competition for 20 years. We are all doing it for 20 years as a result. We didn't spend a lot of time asking if that was the right number. But if your clinical trial takes you so many years to do, right? You have to do a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's going to be less patent life left for the diseases that require very, very long clinical trials. Well, what are those diseases? Any kind of disease that shows that the drug prevented disease would require a very long clinical trial. If I needed to show you that my pill prevented diabetes, prevented a heart attack, I can't just study patients for 6 months. I need to study them for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But the patents are only 20 years long. What does that mean then for us? It means that companies are really going to be drawn to studying diseases where patients are about to die. They're going to be studying diseases in the end of life. Why? Because if patients are about to die, then I only need to do a study for 3 months or 6 months. If I need to show that my drug essentially vaccinates you against this disease, I'm going to have to do the study for 30 or 40 years, right? So unsurprisingly, if I show you my next slide, you'll be shocked to see this. Look at the amount of research in oncology. Look at the blue bars that we're doing, the amount of research we're doing for recurrent cancer and metastatic cancer. Most of the clinical trials are for metastatic cancer. This is cancer that's spread beyond the organ where it started. So metastatic lung cancer it started as lung cancer, but now that cancer has spread to all the other organs in your body. Recurrent cancer is it has come back in some ways. These are cancers where patients are likely to die. That is where we're doing the R&D. And one reason we're doing the R&D in metastatic and recurrent cancer is because for cancer vaccines, the world would love cancer vaccines. If I could give you a vaccine that prevented a cancer from happening in you, you'd be so happy. But we're not doing that kind of research, right? Cancer prevention trials, there's only 523 of them. Why? Because they're very long clinical trials, right? You have to study the patient for 30, 40 years. And so this is incredibly unfortunate, right? And someone asked a great question about what about the WHO? I mean, the problem with the WHO, it has no authority to tell private companies what to do, right? The WHO is a convening organization that helps government coordinate responses against things like pandemic. WHO can't call up a private company and say, you have to do this. A private company is a private company because we can do whatever we want, right? The private company is not going to do something where it loses money. So I think that question is a great question. It's a great question, the question in the chat, because it's highlighting how little attention we spend on this. We say, oh, there is a drug for lung cancer, metastatic lung cancer. It buys me 3 weeks of survival. Why is that? If only we had better drugs. That observation, if only we had better drugs, is in our control. We have to think about creating an incentive system for companies to make cancer vaccines. We can't give the company that generates 3 weeks of survival, 3 weeks of longevity, the same incentives to make a drug as a company that kind of heads off lung cancer for the rest of my life, right? That second company has to be given more incentives. And we don't think like that because we're often thinking that all of drug discovery arises from a serendipitous process, not an economic process, right? So I think there's another great question in the chat about, why is it that HIV and, HIV is a great example of this, where we used incentives. We used incentives to change the shape of what was happening, right? So let's just jump out to HIV for a second. When I was a kid growing up in Delhi, in India, I would get Time in Newsweek at home. And I would read the covers of Time in Newsweek, right? Look at these covers. This is the cover from 1984, right? This new disease called AIDS was out in America. We didn't know what it was. The gay population was dying. And eventually we started to write stories about how heterosexuals were getting HIV as well, right? So these are stories from 1983, 1984. We didn't know what to do about HIV. Now, fast forward 30 years. In HIV, look at the incredible innovation that's happened in HIV, starting with the first monotherapy in 1987. Look at the number of drugs that have come to market, right? So I'm on the right, I've got all the FDA approved drugs. Basically, what we've done with HIV is we don't have a vaccine for it because the HIV virus is a very clever virus. It's not like the COVID virus. It's a much smarter virus. The virus actually integrates itself into the genome of the human being. So the virus is hiding inside your DNA. So it's very hard to find the virus and kill it because you'll end up killing the patient. We have drugs for HIV, and they've basically made HIV a chronic disease. If you're diagnosed with HIV today early, you can still live to be 70 and 80 years old. But in the 1980s and 1990s, it was a missing medicine. How did we change that? We changed that by doing two things. The first thing we did was we poured billions of dollars into HIV research, right? We gave the US government, European government said, HIV is here, it's going to be a big problem. We don't understand virology. We're going to spend a lot understanding the basic science behind it, number one. And the second thing we did was we paid very high prices for those drugs. So there was a profit incentive to discover those drugs. So HIV, we didn't say, oh, it's all serendipitous. No, we didn't say that at all. We made it our problem. We took it on. And I think the world did extremely well, right? Some of these drugs are still not available around the world, and that's a big problem. Some of these drugs are, right? Many of these drugs are available around the world, which is a great thing. But I would argue that making the drugs affordable to people is actually a much easier problem than discovering the drugs in the first place. If we're not able to make drugs affordable, it just means that we're timid. It means we're cheap. We're not willing to write checks for people who are sick. Discovery is a much harder process, right? And I think we want to think about other diseases where discovery has really held us back. One of them is Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is only the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, but it is a big problem, and it'll be a very big problem around the world because it's not completely understood. The US alone spends about $500 billion a year on Alzheimer's in the form of healthcare for Alzheimer's patients, nursing home care, but also in the form of the lost productivity of caregivers, wives, sisters, daughters, daughter-in-laws, often women, right? It's often women who take care of Alzheimer's patients. The emotional cost of taking care of Alzheimer's patients is colossal. I saw that in my own family. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and she lived with us. And I saw what Alzheimer's did not only to her, you know, she was losing her mind, she was losing her memory, she was becoming a child. But what I saw that was just as important was what it was doing to my mother, who was taking care of my grandmother. My mother was tired. My mother aged as a result of taking care of my grandmother. She was less productive at work. It affected my mother's marriage with her husband. So the cost of Alzheimer's is colossal today. It will be even bigger in the future. But if you think about the challenge with Alzheimer's is this graph over here. The failure rates associated with Alzheimer's drug discovery are incredibly high, right? So if you see that number at the bottom, you know, these are funnel plots that are showing you the overall success rate for every 100 drugs that start, you know, drug discovery and preclinical discovery. How many actually end up being successful? So the first funnel plot is HCV, that's hepatitis C. The answer is 2%. So you start with 100 ideas, only 2 are successful. Alzheimer's, you start with 200 ideas, only 1 is successful. Antibiotics, you start with 100 ideas, only about 5% of them are successful. And on average, for every 100 ideas you start with, 4% will be successful. Drug discovery is not for people who want certainty in their lives. It's for people who are actually quite comfortable with failure. Most of the time you will fail. You can see where the failure happens. It often happens in Alzheimer's between preclinical studies and phase 1 studies. What does that mean? It means that these are ideas that we think will be successful when we try them in mice and monkeys. But when we start to try them in human beings, right, they fail. Why would they fail more for Alzheimer's than for other diseases? Well, one reason is Alzheimer's drugs have to cross the blood-brain barrier, right? The drug is working inside the brain. The brain is the most fragile organ that the human body has. And so a lot of Alzheimer's drugs work fine in mammals that are not humans, but are deadly in human beings. So we stop a lot of the drug discovery at phase 1 because these drugs end up being very dangerous. What does that mean? It means we need to understand some basic biochemistry, some basic cell biology of the brain. Who will do that? No pharmaceutical company will do that, because if you are a pharmaceutical company and I'm a pharmaceutical company, I'm not going to do research that benefits you. You're not going to do research that benefits me, right? The only kind of person who will do this research is a scientist who's funded by a government grant. So we need much more government funding of the basic science behind Alzheimer's. Once we understand the basic science behind Alzheimer's, which is about genetics, it's about cell biology, molecular biology, perhaps regenerative medicine, perhaps some genetics. Now we can start to think about companies coming in with ideas for drugs, but we're going to have to think a lot about the basic kind of fact that we need a lot more funding of basic science research. The biggest funder of basic science research is the US government in the world, and it has really not been funding basic science as much as it used to. As a share of GDP, funding for basic science, that's the NIH, that's the National Institutes of Health, has actually been falling since about 2005. And so you can see today, if we had just continued the trend that we had historically, basic science funding would be about $60 billion a year, but it's only about $28 billion a year. So there's a shortfall, colossal shortfall of about $30 billion a year, which affects the quality of the medicines that are coming to market because we don't have enough investment in basic science. So if the question is, what are the policies we can design? Let's learn from HIV. With HIV, when HIV hit the United States, we spent on the basic science of HIV. And from that, we got all of those drugs. If we're worried about Alzheimer's, we have got to finance, not the companies, finance the basic science. Because if you have good basic science, the companies will come in on their own, right? But when we talk about financing it, we've got to talk about the right scale of ambition here. We're talking about $30 billion, which I think the United States has the $30 billion. And you can see US funding for the different diseases. Alzheimer's gets about $2 billion of NIH funding. Cancer gets about $6 billion, right? And I think that's a problem because, look, there's going to be much more Alzheimer's in the world than there will be cancer. I think the US government and governments around the world need to spend much more on Alzheimer's research, not Alzheimer's drugs. The drugs are all rubbish right now for Alzheimer's. So we don't need to spend on the drugs because they're not good drugs. We want good drugs. And the way to get them is to think about spending more on the basic science of Alzheimer's research. So that's kind of one thing. The other barrier to innovation is often that not enough people think about entering the life sciences. So there's this problem in economics that my colleague at Harvard, Raj Shetty, refers to as the problem of lost Einsteins. Einstein was probably the greatest scientist of the 20th century. And Raj's belief is that there's a lot of people who don't go into science. Smart people who don't go into science. And so if you look at the top graph, he's showing you the extent to which children with top math scores patent something. The patent is just one measure of entrepreneurial ability, of this willingness to discover something. So kids from the poorest families versus kids from the richest family, the patenting rate for kids with top math scores is so much lower. It's 1.2 per 1,000 children if you come from the bottom fifth of family income, and it's much higher for kids from richer families. If you look at kids with low math scores, you can see kids from richer families have the same patenting rate as the patenting rate of kids who come from the bottom fifth of family income with top math scores. So this is a problem because it creates missing medicines, right? When society doesn't find great Einsteins, great entrepreneurs who exist throughout society, society loses. It's not just that child from the low-income background who loses, society loses because that child is a great child. That child is going to make discoveries that benefit all, right? So I don't want us to leave this talk thinking that the only barrier to innovation is prices, is profit, is writing checks to NIH. It's also thinking about how we discover people who would be good inventors and help them become great inventors. We need to expose them to these ideas of entrepreneurship. That's something that we like to do a lot of, at HBS. We think a lot about those kinds of problems. There's another problem that we don't know the answer to very well. And that is this idea that, here's just a simple cartoon. On the left-hand side is academia, right? That's like the university, the research lab, they're doing discovery. And on the right is industry, hospitals, companies. And so you want to make sure that the idea from academia makes it across this bridge. If the idea is discovered on one side of the river and doesn't make it to the other side of the river, it's as good as the idea never have been discovered in the first place, right? And one of the things that we know is that there might be these broken bridges, these valleys of death, where the idea just falls into the middle of the ocean and is lost forever. So I want to show you some facts on this. If you look at the top science journals in the world, the British Medical Journal, Cell, the Journal of the American Medical Association, Lancet, Nature, New England Journal of Medicine and Science, look at the share of papers published in these top journals that come from Boston, San Francisco, the Washington, D.C. area, SD is San Diego, Los Angeles, New Haven, Baltimore, the Durham, Chapel Hill, Chicago, and New York. Look at the variation. These are the 10 leading American cities. So I'm not trying to make fun of New York here. New York, don't think of New York as being low. Just think of it as these are the top 10. So when you pick another American city, Cincinnati, pick another American city, Houston, pick another American city, Phoenix, pick another American city like Philadelphia, they're not on this chart. Why are they not on this chart? They have great universities, they have great hospitals, they have great researchers. What is happening in these 3 or 4 cities that is allowing them to produce much more research than some of the other cities? Why is this important? It's important because it becomes another source of missing medicines, right? If we could get other cities around the world to have these great basic science discoveries, we'd have more companies coming in. It also has implications for economic inequality. Look at where all the venture capital dollars are going. The venture capital dollars are going to the Bay Area. It's going to Boston. It's going to San Diego. It's not going to so many great cities around the world, right? The venture capitalists are going to send their money to places that are coming up with new ideas. That's where they're going to send their money because they want to take those new ideas, make companies, and make money at the end of it. But think about all the economic growth we could create if we had more scientific discovery happening throughout the United States and throughout the world, because the world has so many great cities, right? I actually don't believe that there's something special about San Francisco and Boston. Or if there is, we need to understand what it is better so that we can replicate that in other cities. So that's something for us to really be thinking a lot more about over time. So I want to take some questions from you. I'm going to wrap up and say, listen, at the end of the day, I'm motivated by this question because what I want to do is I want to reduce disease. I want to reduce human suffering. That's what I want to do. I think the answer to reducing human suffering means marrying, science, finance, public policy. They have to be married. I think reducing human suffering is not just a scientific problem. It's an economic policy problem as much as it is a science problem. I think we have to think a lot about the fact that right now the world is relying on the US market to get a lot of medical innovation. I think that's problematic because there's many diseases that happen around the world that the US will never care about, right? And so we are relying on American taxpayers and American voters to solve problems for the rest of the world, and they're unlikely to do that. They're unlikely to do that. So we need to think about alternatives to the US, to relying on the US for all of this innovation. The second point is just kind of thinking about how firms invest. Firms are not making random investment decisions. They think a lot about how much money they're going to make. And a lot of the money that they're going to make depends on how long they can make that money, right? So a company that can make money for 10 years is going to invest a lot more than a company that can make money for 1 year. Patent lives really, really matter. Willingness to pay really, really matters. I think the public sector, government financing of basic science research also really matters, because firms will not do basic science research on their own. But if the public sector subsidized it, then companies can come in and develop those ideas. I think we should be thinking also about other ideas, not just relying on capital markets and profit maximizing firms. Just like we were able to put a man on the moon in the late 1960s, no private company did that. Government did that, right? We just put another lander on Mars. The Chinese just put another lander on Mars, right? That was not a private company. Governments can do very complicated things. But so maybe we should be thinking about these ideas like a NASA for drug development, a government-run agency whose sole job it is to discover these missing medicines. And I think finally, we should be not just thinking that all of life is a finance problem. I think it is, I'm an economist, but I think there's also these non-price barriers to innovation. Like the best scientists are not going into science. They might not have the opportunity to know about what it takes to go and work at a life sciences company. And so they don't go into the life sciences, and it becomes a big loss for society. And I think that finally, I will say, because people misunderstand my talk, they say, oh, you're saying that luck doesn't matter. I'm saying luck matters a lot. Luck matters a ton. I don't want luck to matter, right? So the fact that luck matters means we're not putting enough emphasis on the public policies that would ensure that luck doesn't matter. We don't want luck, right? So I think we want to make sure that luck is a very weak force for innovation. But as long as it remains a strong force, I think we're getting innovation policy wrong, not only in the US, but also around the world. So I'm going to stop there. We've got a little bit of time. I'd love to take questions. If you have questions, just raise your hand and Tiara and the team will call on you, and then you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much for that amazing session, Amitabh. And yes, the way we'll run Q&A is please raise your hand and we'll call on you, or I can pull comments from the chat. Like Amitabh said at the beginning, I think listening is a large part of the learning process. And so if you're a student who has been able to ask many questions or speak a lot in the sessions, please try and make space for other students to have time to comment. So just give everyone a couple seconds to raise their hand. And Fizra, we can start with you for the Q&A. And then again, really encourage students who haven't had a chance to speak yet. Okay, great. Fizra will go to you, and then Brandon will go to you. Fizra, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so my question was that Tapsir told us that it takes around 30 to 40 years to make vaccination and prevention of diseases. So how come companies were able to make vaccinations for COVID in just a year or so?
Sorry, Fizra, I didn't understand your question. The audio was not coming through clearly.
Fizra, are you able to go?
My question was that
Hey, Fizra, keep going. I can hear you. Yeah, hold your mic up very closely. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So I was asking that you told us that it takes around 30 to 40 years to prevent diseases and make vaccinations. So how come companies were able to make vaccinations for COVID-19 in a year or so?
So how come companies what? I didn't understand the last part.
Fizra, can I summarize?
We're able to make, yeah, sure.
So I think the question was how if I know you said that the companies typically take 10 years or something to make a vaccine. So how come the COVID vaccine came so quickly?
Oh, the COVID vaccine was, a lot of it was just serendipity, right? Serendipity, because the basic science research was done by Carolyn Karko at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1990s. It was a pure basic science insight, and it was available to us. Moderna had already been created; they had already gone public. They weren't trying to make vaccines for COVID. COVID happened, boom, the vaccine was available. If this had happened 10 years ago, we would be dying around the world, right? The basic scientist, this scientist rescued us, and capital markets rescued us because Moderna had been formed. That was pure chance that we were rescued. This was not systematic, clever thinking or anything like that, right? So that is not a recipe I want to bet on. I don't want to bet on the fact that we had a great scientist who was an immigrant to the United States who had written the basic science paper, and another company that was trying to do work in cancer. They made the connection when COVID happened, and now they gave us the vaccine. I don't think that was a good recipe, because like I said, if it had happened 10 years ago, if COVID had happened 10 years ago, we wouldn't have known what to do, right? We'd be dying around the world, which would be very sad. And if you look at the companies that have not succeeded, a lot of the companies that haven't succeeded are the companies that were trying the old approaches to making vaccines, right? So a lot of the vaccines that are using like inactivated vaccine viruses and all, they're working, but they're not working as good as the mRNA vaccines, right? And it's going to take them years to figure out how to make those vaccines excellent. In 1 year, they just can't do it. And I think that's a poor recipe. That's a poor recipe for the world. I think like kind of relying on this great scientist and this other great company to be present, that's a bad recipe. We should have had a plan.
Great, thank you for the question, Fizra. Brandon, over to you.
Thank you. I have a question. What is the role of the price ceilings by trying to make medicine accessible to people? This wouldn't make the companies be less willing to develop new medicines. And also I have another question. In the presentation, you were talking about that some places are developing more medicines than the others. Wouldn't it be better to take the advantage of these places to have a competitive advantage than other places, and just make them to develop more medicines by letting them do that?
Yeah. So one view, Brandon, is just that like, well, Boston and San Francisco do all this innovation, let them keep doing it. The problem is that there's a constraint to how much innovation they can do. Boston is a city. It has a certain amount of road space. It has one airport. Traffic becomes very, very dense. Housing prices become very expensive. So even though it could do more innovation, at some point it stops, and then the world doesn't get a bunch of medicine. So I would like a lot of this innovation to be done around the world. That's the second answer to your question. On the first answer, I think the world cares about poor people getting vaccines for COVID because it's a communicable disease. If it was not a communicable disease, I don't think the world would care that much at all, which is very sad. It's a very bad thing. But I think the rich countries care about the poor countries because they're worried they might get it, not because they're sort of intrinsically caring about the poor countries. Because if they intrinsically cared, they would have solved malaria, and they have not.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question, Brandon. Let's go to Atif. Are you able to unmute yourself? So it looks like Atif is...
Atif, why don't you type in your question? Because we're not able to hear you very well.
Am I audible?
Atif, can you type your question, please? And then we can respond to your comment from the chat. Does that sound good? And then Amitabh, in terms of time, I wanted to check in.
Yeah, let's go to 11:05 if it's okay. I'm giving you Boston time 11:05, so maybe 5 more minutes.
Perfect. That sounds great. I'm sure the students with their hands up are very happy to hear you say that. Favor, are you able to unmute yourself?
Favor, you're next.
Okay, Favor is also going to type in the chat.
Okay.
All right, Samuel, go ahead.
I have 2 questions.
Let's do one question just so
okay.
we can, thank you.
What would you say is the best course of action for a country to resupply their medicine stock if they have a drought of medicine?
What is the best strategy for a country to do what? Did you say, Samuel?
To resupply their stock of medicine if the current government doesn't have the power to supply their the people with medicine.
I mean, are you talking? Give me an example, Samuel.
In Mexico, a lot of people don't have the medicine they need because hospitals don't have the capabilities to supply with them.
Yeah, so this problem of like supply and demand is often a problem of prices, right? So the government is often paying a lower price than would be necessary to clear the market. The government will always say that like, well, we don't want to pay that very high price. I get that, but that's no different than saying we don't care about the sick patient. That's no different. Government is willing to spend a lot of money on healthy people, and it should learn to spend more on sick people. But government cares much more about healthy people than it does about sick people. But the whole point of government is to care about sick people. That's the reason we have government. Healthy people can take care of themselves. So I think this is, whenever this happens, it happens in the US as well. I think of it as just a failure of government.
Okay.
Right? It's one reason why over time, I'm a big fan of government, just so you know, but over time, I've become much more willing to say that maybe you should always have private markets and government, because when you have private markets, at least it works for rich people. And so poor people can get angry when they see it working for rich people, and they can vote out the government. If it's all run by government, then what happens is the rich people will get on a plane and go to Miami or wherever, and nobody sees the inequality. You need to see the inequality to fix it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great
Yeah, I'm getting a
question.
lot of questions about traditional methods. I'm not a fan of traditional medicine. I don't think it actually works. I think there's a lot of false hope that comes with traditional medicine. I'm not saying it'll never work, but if you think about most diseases have a very specific physiological pathway that's been activated to cause the disease. Even something like cancer is not caused by one pathway. There's about 16 different ways that a person could get colon cancer. Just in the colon or in the stomach, there's a variety of different things. My colon cancer could be quite different than your colon cancer. And you need a drug. The really good drugs are drugs that act on the very specific pathway. So you take something like breast cancer, there's HER2 positive breast cancer, there's BRCA positive breast cancer, there's triple negative breast cancer. These are all statements about the proteins that are being expressed on the surface of the breast cancer tumor. You need a different drug for each of these different types of breast cancer. There's no amount of traditional medicine that kind of works on all the 3 different types of breast cancer. So I think it's actually just false hope. It's what you do when you can't afford the expensive drugs and things like that. But in general, I'm not a fan of any of this.
Great. I think, Amitabh, we have time for one more question, if that sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Guilherme, we'll go to you.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. I had 2 questions, but I will ask just one because of the time. I would like to know if a government can offer to the companies some tax incentives to make medicines, just like the US are doing with people to get vaccinated. Just doing an example, some tax incentives or other incentives to produce new medicines.
You're really ahead of me. You're ahead of me. I think what you're saying is one of the most powerful yet unexplored tools available to government. The traditional way to induce medicines is to say, I'll pay a very high price. That's the traditional way of doing it. And it's very expensive because if you say you have to pay a very high price, then you got to pay a very high price. There's another way to do it, which is what you're getting at, which is to say, if you're a company and you give us this great medicine, you won't have to pay taxes for so many years or something like that, right? And all those benefits accrue early to the company. That would be like an R&D tax credit. So we say to companies, you know, if you're doing R&D in Alzheimer's, we'll give you a tax credit. We don't even care if you're successful. We'll just give you a tax credit. We'll subsidize R&D investments by companies. We could do that. Every government in the world could do that. The US government always did that, but we just lowered our tax incentives to R&D companies. We lowered it from 50% to 25%. That's the opposite of what you're proposing. But I think it's a very powerful device, and there's a lot of evidence that it actually works. And so if your problem is missing medicines, the solution could be R&D tax credits.
Great, thank you.
So I'm going to wrap up. It was an honor. It's a privilege to see all of you. I know you have so many things to be doing today, and thank you for joining this call. You know, I wanted you to just leave with this idea that for me, the biggest problems, the two biggest problems facing our planet are climate change and sick people. You don't hear from sick people because they're too ill to vote. They're too ill and tired to write and talk. But that doesn't mean it's not a problem. All the science that we have in the world, the point of that science should be to reduce human suffering. The point of government ought to be to reduce human suffering, not to build a better airport and all of that. That's important, but that's like not actually the point of government. So, you know, when I think about the big issues out there in the world, respiratory distress, HIV, COVID, Alzheimer's, you know, protecting kids from a variety of diseases they have when they're infants. These are all problems that I think science and public policy can solve. Maybe the answer is R&D tax credits. Maybe some of the answer is more research for basic science. It is all within our grasp. The reason it's within our grasp is because we have solved much harder problems as a country, as a planet. We have solved much harder problems than these little problems that we could solve. And so if you're ever interested in that, I hope to see you all in my classroom in a couple of years. And thank you again for spending this time with me.
Thank you so much, Amitabh, for your time this morning. And I'm sure that you're looking at the chat, and I know the students really, really loved hearing from you and learned so much from you. And thank you also for your thoughtful responses to all their questions. Really appreciate you joining us this morning. And so please give a huge shout out or send your thank you in the chat. Amitabh, please feel free to hop off. I know we're a little bit over time.
I have another call, so I